a.m. politics show. We have a full one for you today. And as we usually get to do, we get to kick off with Jennifer Lawless down at American University to talk about politics inside the Beltway. Jennifer, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
We are cranking up here, that is for sure, but lots happening both in DC and around the country. And I definitely want to kick off talking about Sinclair and that threat to our democracy script, which just made the rounds yesterday. This was a Deadspin video that showed the compilation of Sinclair affiliates reading from the same script. Here in Rhode Island, we looked at JAR 10's involvement as well. What's the takedown there? We saw the president's response, dug in his heel, called everyone else fake news. Is this going anywhere? Will there be repercussions, or are they just going to dig their heels in?
I think there could be repercussions because it looks as close to explicit government propaganda as we've ever seen, right? We know that the president doesn't believe that the mainstream media are able to cover him objectively. We know that he gets most of his news from Fox News. We know that he thinks that there's no fairness in the mainstream establishment. But this is the first time that we've actually seen a White House pretty much write the script and demand that a set of mainstream media outlets, as part of Sinclair Broadcasting, say exactly what it is that he wants. And so, I think the general reaction among the media as well as political activists is that this is probably a step too far. And we're also beginning to see some of the people who were required to read those scripts have begun to fight back. We saw that in Seattle, for example, where some of these anchors are saying, wait a minute, I can't believe I was just forced to do that. This is crazy.
I mean, talk about your reaction when you saw that video, just from a video editing standpoint of compiling all the same words. I mean, literally, what did you think when you saw it?
I mean, I thought it was a campaign ad. At first, when I saw it, I thought it was a situation where, like, the Republicans or the Democrats are airing a series of statements, that Nancy Pelosi or, Paul Ryan said, and having all of the candidates repeat those kinds of things. It was stunning to me because it was unbelievable that that was not rehearsed, right? That was just people willing to read the script that was put in front of them. And that's, I think, very scary when we think about journalists as being sort of this independent fourth branch of government. If this is the kind of slippage that we can see, it opens the door for a lot more propaganda than I think the United States realized we were, well ready to accept.
And I mean, as far as pushback goes, I mean, do you think Sinclair will see any? I mean, we've heard from Kentucky, one congressional candidate pulling ads there, or are they almost that too big to fail?
They might be too big to fail, but I don't know how much success they'll have in acquiring additional outlets. And if they want to continue to grow their reach, then I think this threatens that a little bit. This also really opens the door for the mainstream media becoming explicitly partisan, because you can imagine another reaction, which would be that one of their competitors would decide, okay, well, if they're going to be the Trump news outlet, we're going to be the opposite of that. We're accustomed to that with Fox News and with MSNBC. We're not really accustomed to that with the 6 o'clock news in our local communities. And that's a pretty slippery and I think dangerous slope to go down.
And you talk about at the local level, we've definitely seen some pushback here, especially in social media. I've seen from folks saying, well, that's it, I'm not going to watch. Do you think it will affect not just advertising, but their bottom line and viewership?
I do, and I also think it affects citizen knowledge and participation. The local media are one of the dying breeds of media in this country, but they're still the main source of information that citizens access when they want to know what's going on at the city level or in county government or at the school board level. And if more and more people are unable to rely on those outlets, and if revenues decrease in those outlets, then that's going to mean serious decreases in potential information going to citizens. And that sort of throws into question the watchdog nature of our democracy as well.
Well, it's continued to dominate the news. After you, Jennifer, we're going to have Kate Israel from Rhode Island College talking about the media implications. So let's tag from Sinclair to the Hill. Let's talk about the collapse of yet another look at DACA and where things currently stand.
This is actually unbelievable to me because the president doesn't seem to realize or remember or whatever that he ended DACA. So the fact that he's blaming Democrats and saying that the Dreamers are in this really bad predicament because the Democrats let them down at the same time that he's saying that under no circumstances will there be any DACA deal is somewhat stunning to me. And I think a lot of journalists and a lot of Democrats are also sort of left with their, not sure what to do or how to respond. I don't know if you saw yesterday or the day before at this press conference, Jim Acosta from CNN said, wait, President Trump, don't you remember you're the one that killed DACA? And he looked at him like he was crazy, right? And so when that's how you're dealing with a White House, it's hard to figure out the next steps, but it leaves Congress in this very, very tricky position because they don't want to have this issue unresolved heading into the midterm elections. But by the same token, the Republicans cannot in any way count on a White House to work with them to generate a compromise.
So is it anyone's guess what happens now?
I think so. Donald Trump has taken every possible position on this issue as you could imagine in just the last couple of months alone. So, I'm reluctant to say that, well, there will never be a compromise, because the fact that the president said there will never be a compromise suggests that there probably will at one point be a compromise.
I never know what to expect down there. And speaking of, did he or didn't he, former Veterans Affairs Secretary Shulkin fired, resigned, and why does it matter which?
So this is a good one. Donald Trump and the White House say that Shulkin resigned. Shulkin then made the Sunday morning news tour and has been on pretty much every network since then saying absolutely not. He was fired. John Kelly gave him a heads up, but he was officially fired via tweet, which is not the first cabinet secretary now to be fired via tweet. And I think this is important because it's clear that Donald Trump is reshuffling the cabinet with people who he wants to surround himself with. And it's not that there are people in there who are unwilling to go along with his agenda or who are making his life difficult and who are resigning. It's that they're all being forced out. And the fact that the administration explicitly lied about how Shulkin was fired suggests that they are not at all concerned about the optics of these kinds of things. So, I think that it just highlights one more area where the press and communications office in the White House is not particularly concerned about the way things appear.
And you talk about the way they appear. I mean, there must be some concern from the Trump administration to say that, oh, he resigned, when he pushed back and said, no, I was fired. So do you think they have concerns, as you said, as they're reshuffling the deck, they want to make it seem like he opted out, but when in fact he's saying he was pushed?
I think that they have so much other stuff going on that this is not something that they have to even really worry about. They're focused more on his successor, who is completely unqualified and has no managerial experience. And they're also now focused on other cabinet secretaries and other departments. And so, this is one of the positive repercussions for the Trump administration of so much news happening so frequently. No one thing is something that they have to constantly hit back on because there are a million things being thrown at the wall.
So speaking of the million things, my list is quite long here. Let's go to EPA Scott Pruitt. Does he survive?
Well, Donald Trump tweeted and called him and told him not to worry about it. You're good to go, which is basically the recipe for being forced out in this administration, right? So he had done the same thing to Rex Tillerson. He had done the same thing. He had a conversation with Shulkin the day that he was fired and had actually scheduled a meeting with him for the next day. He did the same thing with H.R. McMaster. So if I were Scott Pruitt, I would be packing my bags right now because this is sort of the lead up to being sure that you're not going to have a job in about a week.
And so let's talk about that revelation that he was basically lodging at a lobbyist's property and, $50 a night in Washington, D.C. Should he have known better?
Of course. But yes. But I also think in the broad scheme of things, this is one of those situations where if the administration was keeping tabs on what its cabinet secretaries were doing, this wouldn't have gone on for as long as it went on. So, I'm sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place here because I think a lot of these offenses are fireable and they should be forced out because this isn't the kind of government that you want. And these are abuses that we wouldn't accept in any other realm or in any other industry. By the same token, all of this was completely public and well known, and that's been the case in all of these cabinet positions, in all of these agencies. And the White House basically turns a deaf ear until it's politically expedient for them to fire this person. So, I just don't think that. I think he's gone, but it's probably not going to be because of the lodging. It's going to be for a variety of other reasons, or who Donald Trump would prefer to be surrounded with.
keeping an eye on the revolving door in the Trump administration. Let's tack over to Special Counsel Mueller. We did see the sentencing today for lawyer Alex van der Zwaan. Is that really a household name in D.C. right now?
Only so much as it signals what these consequences will be for lying to the general counsel, for lying to Mueller, and lying to the independent counsel. So, he was given basically a slap on the wrist. So 30 days in jail, a hefty fine. But I think more importantly, and the reason everybody's paying attention, is because it lets us know the kinds of punishments and the deals that Mueller is likely going to cut with names that are more common and known in the typical DC household these days. And the fact that it was a slap on the wrist, I think, should scare the Trump administration pretty substantially, because it means that Mueller is willing to, extract a lot from the people that he's cooperating with. And as a result, reward them with relatively small penalties, assuming that this is indicative of what we can expect moving forward.
I think that was the indication with, again, the 30 days for Alex van der Zwaan. Let's talk a little bit, speaking of legal matters, we didn't get you on the show last week, but it continues to be an issue here in Rhode Island and other states, the 2020 census. There was just an event with Democratic leaders here yesterday in Rhode Island about the citizenship question. We talked with the Republican side here, which I want to pick your brain about shortly. But do you think these states that are filing this suit regarding the question of citizenship have any hope of winning?
Yes. For a couple of reasons. The first is that the facts that the White House is basing sort of their decision on and saying that this question has been included except for 2010 are just blatantly not true. The question has never been asked to every census recipient. Never more than 20% of the recipients have gotten that question. And, this is a situation where there are now really big ramifications that have to do with redistricting and reapportionment. And we've seen the Democrats win in several of these other redistricting cases over the course of the last year or so. So, to the extent that there are real disincentives for people who are immigrants to report their citizenship, that can very much affect Democratic urban areas, and that affects the overall count. It affects how many districts the state gets, and it affects the district lines around the districts that it does. And so, when you've got 17 states in the District of Columbia already saying this is not okay, I think that there's a decent shot.
Well, I don't think anyone's probably quaking in their boots more than Rhode Island, who could possibly stand to lose a congressional seat in the 2020 census. But again, on the Republican side of things, here we heard from everyone from Minority Leader Patricia Morgan, who very much backed the Trump administration on it. Joe Trillo, the former campaign chair for Trump, who's now running as an independent, did. Mayor Alan Fung, however, was silent on the issue. I mean, I'm assuming some Republicans will find themselves between a rock and a hard place.
I think any Republican that has a heart and a head will find themselves between a rock and a hard place. And I'm comforted to know that Mayor Fung is in that category. I mean, this is a situation where, under ordinary circumstances, the question would be somewhat alarming, and there could be real consequences for the count. But at this current point in time, what this administration is doing with immigration policy and the information it's collecting makes it absolutely absurd to think that this is an appropriate question to ask and get any kind of relevant information from. So if this isn't an explicit power grab, then I've never really seen one. And the consequences, I really think, could be very dramatic, not only for our district lines, but also for us having a general sense of how many people live in this country. And that's the kind of information that's somewhat useful to Democrats and Republicans alike.
To get a full count, a real count. Well, we still have you here. One or two more questions, Jennifer. Let's talk about, it was just a week ago Sunday, Stormy Daniels got the biggest ratings ever on 60 Minutes. We've seen it sort of settle into the legal machinations now, suits, countersuits, etc. Is this the last we've heard from Stormy Daniels, or do you think there's more to come?
Oh, I think there's more to come. I think the 60 Minutes interview was sort of the pinnacle in that she needed to communicate to the American public that she was a smart person who was not just trying to drive up her own personal success. And I think that she did that well. I think Anderson Cooper did as well as any journalist could do in that situation. But it now makes sense in terms of how the legal process works that we're going to hear less from her while the case is beginning to move through and while there are questions about who's allowed to ask whom what and when. But I think we're far from this being the end of the Stormy Daniels controversy.
And is sort of the big point here, the one that folks keep focusing on, again, that payment just prior to the election, is that the smoking gun? Is that the potential for an illegal campaign contribution, whether or not the president knew about it? Or are there other things to look at as well?
I mean, I think that that's a big part of it, but we also know that campaign finance violations are really hard to prove, and they're also very difficult to generate any real penalties around. So it's pretty much up to the Federal Election Commission, which is a political entity. And on top of that, you've also got a situation where playing dumb seems to work. We also have precedent suggesting that, John Edwards, for example, had a pretty, substantial public trial and was able to get off of that. So it's not as, his circumstances weren't as perhaps damning as Trump's, but I don't think we're going to take down a presidency on a campaign finance violation.
Well, we'll continue to watch everything going on inside and outside the Beltway. And Jennifer Lawless, I appreciate, as always, you're taking the time to Skype into us here at GoLocal.
Have a good week.
Okay, thanks, you too. Jennifer Lawless down at American University giving us the skinny inside the Beltway. Lots to talk about this week. Lots to talk about here in Rhode Island. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with our next guest.